but that a number of people, including some in high places, wanted to keep secret. The case against Mr. Bubbles. In that report, parents named Tony Derrin as the man who had sexually assaulted their children. Derrin's wife ran the kindergarten they attended. Tonight we investigate another crucial aspect of this disturbing case. You'll remember police listed 17 young victims, and more than 50 criminal charges were eventually laid. But when the Mr. Bubbles case went to court, not one of the children was called to give evidence. The charges were thrown out, and Tony Derrin was set free. One of the key Derrin witnesses was a hired gun from the United States, a psychologist named Ralph Underwager, who says he's an expert in child sexual abuse. He testified that the children's evidence had been contaminated and that they were too young to know what the truth was. But just what is Mr. Underwager's expertise? And how much respect does he command in American courts? We went there to find out. And we should warn that at times in this report, the language has to be quite explicit.
You're a bastard.
No, I'm not.
You're a bastard.
This is Ralph Underwager, psychologist. He was paid $25,000 and gave crucial evidence in favour of Tony Derrin. Evidence which helped Derrin walk free.
Your people can leave now. You go out the door now.
When we wanted to question Mr. Underwager about his involvement in the Bubbles case, the questions got too harsh.
You go out the door now.
But first, a reminder of the case against Mr. Bubbles.
Jocelyn said that they got undressed and that they got into a bathtub that was full of bubbles and that they played in the bathtub.
Did Mr. Bubbles ever get in the bath himself?
Yes, he did.
She
said that he got in without any clothes on.
They'd get undressed and get in the bath while he had a shower. He had a shower before he hopped in the bath with them.
Mr. Bubbles?
Yes.
Always the same story. 3- and 4-year-olds being lured into bubble baths with a man who sexually abused them.
Having examined them and talked with them, our unit's convinced that those children were sexually abused.
Absolutely no doubt.
No doubt at all.
That's the evidence Professor Kim Oates wanted to give in court, but he was never asked. As head of the Child Protection Unit at the Camperdown Children's Hospital in Sydney, he's known around the world as an expert in detecting child sexual abuse. So we have 18 children who were examined, 5 of whom your staff say were definitely sexually abused, and all of them from the same preschool. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think if you look at the incidence of significant child sexual abuse in the community, significant enough to leave physical findings in the preschool age group, I think it's extraordinary.
Did Jocelyn ever say whether Mr. Bubbles hurt her?
We asked her that question and she said, no, he didn't, but he has very strong hands.
This is Jocelyn's medical report from the Children's Hospital, and it's very clear. There had been trauma specifically directed at the genitalia.
You can't let people walk around scot-free abusing children.
As the word spread, more and more children were taken to the local police station after initial questioning by their distraught parents. Questions which brought bizarre answers and led police here. The kindergarten the children attended, Sea Beach Kindergarten. The children told parents and police how they were taken from here for parties, special parties, hosted by Mr. Bubbles.
Do you know Mr. Bubbles?
Yes.
This reenactment is from the official police transcript.
Did Mr. Bubbles touch you between your legs?
On my toes.
Yes, did he touch your toes?
Mr. Bubbles naughty to touch my toes.
This is Debbie's medical report. Once again, it was positive. There was sexual abuse.
I just, totally spun out on that because I would, at that point, had been trying to tell myself that no, this wasn't happening. It wasn't true. Who would interfere with my child?
I
I put some things in his body and he put some things in my body, but I didn't want him to.
Cindy's medical report confirms she was abused. The doctor found signs consistent with traumatic dilatation of the anus.
What does Mr. Bubbles look like?
Big black hair everywhere.
Have you ever had a sore fanny, Elaine?
Yes.
Why was it sore?
Mr. Bubbles did it.
As her mother, what was your reaction to all of this?
Kill him. If I could get hold of him. I mean, I just hope he rots in hell. I really do.
Elaine's medical report. Again, positive. Vaginal penetration.
And it's just devastating. Absolutely devastating. Parents might as well put them out in the street. Say, here, have a child for the day. Do what you want to it.
So who is Mr. Bubbles? If you ask the children of the parents we spoke with, you get the same answer.
I held her in the lineup at Mona Vale Police Station, and she identified the man out of the 7 people in that lineup as Mr. Bubbles.
Jane, can I just show you a photograph? Is that the man that Jocelyn identified?
Yes, it is. It's Mr. Bubbles.
And it's also
Anthony Derren.
The police constable showed the photos again and she said, yes, there's the bubble man to that particular photo.
And that man was?
Mr. Derren.
This is Barocco Courthouse, Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. In 1972, Derren was brought here, charged with the aggravated assault of 2 young girls. He'd interfered with them in a swimming pool, something Derren admits, and both charges were proven.
And I must say it's a scar in my life. Probably let's say the first of my life.
Tony Derren made this confession on the Hinge program.
Well, actually, there were two girls between the ages of 10 and 13. Just had in the swimming pool, playing games with the children, and I seem to have this need to touch young girls on the private parts.
Coming back here now feels extremely strange. I've got goosebumps all over me. I feel terrible. I feel very sad.
Julie Mitchell is now 23. She says she was another victim of Tony Derren. Is that Tony Derren?
Yes, he's seems to have put on a little bit of weight since I've known him.
But there's no doubt in your mind that that is the man. How do you feel looking at it now?
Terrible.
After the break, we'll return with the case against Ralph Underwager, the man who helped set Tony Derren free. There's no doubt scores of questions remain unanswered in the Mr. Bubbles case, and some of them relate to Ralph Underwager, the expert witness Tony Derren paid to testify on his behalf. Ralph Underwager was imperative to Tony Derren's defence. As a supposed independent expert, he testified that the evidence of the Bubbles children had become contaminated, and they were too young to understand their duty to tell the truth. But here in America, we've certainly discovered Underwager's reputation and credentials aren't all they're cracked up to be. Mr. Peters, are professional witnesses like Ralph Underwager dangerous?
They can be very dangerous when they...
Jim Peters is a senior attorney with the National Centre for the Prosecution of Child Abuse. He's investigated Underwager for the past 3 years.
Underwager is presented as a scientific observer, when in fact, from our perspective, more often than not, he's there as an advocate.
And anything but independent.
Anything but.
Well, he is someone who makes his living going around the country and testifying against children in child sexual abuse cases. He says the same thing in essentially every case, which is every...
And Anna Salter knows what she's talking about. A PhD from Harvard and a master's degree in early childhood. She says young children can be believed.
I mean, this is consistent with the literature. If you look at what is the best legal textbook in the country today on children as witnesses, Child Witness Theory and Practice, John Meyer says clearly children as young as 3 can comprehend the duty to tell the truth.
And this man is a highly respected legal scholar in America.
I think he's fairly clearly the chief leading scholar on child sexual abuse in the country.
6 American states have given Dr. Salter a grant to check Underwager's methods in court. And what did she find?
That he isn't accurate. That what he says in court does not necessarily fairly represent the literature.
He distorts the facts.
Frequently. Sometimes he quotes specific studies, and he's frequently wrong about what the studies say.
So we thought we'd get Dr. Salter to analyse the evidence Underwager gave under oath at the Mr. Bubbles hearing, where he testified his qualifications had never been questioned. But in an American case, the Swan case, this is what the court said about Ralph Underwager.
The court remains convinced the psychologist did not have the qualifications to testify as a doctor. The trial court ruled that the psychologist's proposed testimony was not proper because there was no indication that the results of the doctor's work had been accepted in the scientific community.
In the Mr. Bubbles case, he said his qualifications were never in question.
Well, if he's talking about the Swan ruling, you could say he was perseverating.
Lying.
Yes.
Now, the second incident in the Mr. Bubbles case was where Underwager said that 90% of accusations against child molesters are wrong. Now, is that backed up scientifically?
No, that's gobbledygook. I don't know of any study that would support that.
This is Underwager's home base, Northfield, Minnesota. His so-called clinic is set on 70 acres of beautiful countryside. We arranged to meet him here to talk about his involvement in the Mr. Bubbles case. And, right on cue, Underwager presents his evidence.
There is a major German study that was done and reported in 1983, and a major finding is that for children who have been abused, the impact of adult behaviors toward actually abused children is more traumatic and does more harm to the children than the abuse itself.
Is that right?
Yes.
What report's this?
It's Bauermann, 1983. In German, it's Sexualität, Gewalt und psychische Folgung.
And what did Bauermann really say?
Well, I'm afraid what it said was, of the reported sexual contacts, half of the sexual victims claimed that the sexual act itself to be the main cause of injury, 1/3 the behavior of the suspect, and 1/10 each the behavior of relatives, friends, or the police. In other words, instead of saying that the majority of children were harmed by the system, they said that it was a very small minority.
Mr. Underwager, I have the Bauermann report in front of me.
Yes, sir.
It's directly opposite to what you just said.
No, I don't believe it is at all. I'm saying, I didn't say that that's what happens in every case.
No, but you said the majority of cases.
No, I don't believe I did.
Over the past couple of years, courts across America have begun saying no to Underwager, that his expert evidence is unreliable. 2 recent cases here in New York said just that. But even more damning was a case last year, the Herrick case.
It was the court's observation that Dr. Underwager's testimony was based on inadequate research, and his preparation was inadequate and therefore lacking in sound foundation.
Again, damning.
Yes, it is.
I mean, there's no bones about it there. Inadequate.
In all of these cases, that's what the courts have ruled.
Just a couple of months before Underwager came to Australia for the Mr. Bubbles case, he came here to testify in this small Indiana town of Winnemac. Population, 4,000. The story which unfolded here in the Winnemac courthouse was one of absolute sexual terror. A 15-year-old girl, Polly Barnes, accused her own father of raping her. Not once, but continually over 4 nights.
Did he tear your clothes off of you or what?
Yes.
What kind of clothes did you have on?
I don't remember.
Then he put you on the bed and tied you up.
Right.
All right. Then what did he do?
Put his penis in my vagina.
Ralph Underwager was hired to defend Polly's father. And as usual, he testified that nothing had happened. It was all a delusion. And Polly had simply made the whole story up. But then Underwager was cross-examined by Polly's lawyer, Charles Vaughan.
He used the theory that it was a delusion of the child, that she was doing a favor for the mother by saying this happened when it really didn't happen, to gain the favor and to be the apple of the eye of the mother.
A delusion that she was continually raped over 4 days.
That's right.
Are you suggesting that your clothes were already off of you?
The clothes were already off of me when I came to.
Polly kept her secret for more than a year. By the time she did tell anyone, it was too late to lay criminal charges. So she took civil action against her own father.
You said your dad forced you to have anal intercourse?
Yes.
Put his penis in your anus?
Yes.
At this legal hearing, Polly was heavily sedated and seated right opposite her father.
The first thing he did you say he performed oral sex on you?
Yes.
You don't make these things up. The trauma had been so great that she'd been under psychiatric care for a year prior to the trial, institutionalized. You don't have this kind of trauma from imagination.
The jury took only an hour to decide that Polly Barnes was telling the truth, and that Ralph Underwager's testimony that nothing had happened could be ignored. In fact, Underwager's evidence was rejected so much, the jury awarded Polly $3.25 million. So while Underwager was being rejected here in America, he had no such trouble at the Mr. Bubbles hearing in Australia, where he testified that the children were too young to tell the truth.
I don't believe that I testified to that at all. And if you'd have to produce something from the transcript. That's not what I testified to. What I testified to is, I believe, basically that up to about age 6 or 7, the psychological research suggests or shows that the concept children have of truth is going to be one primarily of what keeps me out of trouble.
Well, I do happen to have a part of the transcript.
Fine.
Let me read it to you. This is what you said in court. Children up to age 10 or 11 simply do not have the capacity to think abstractly.
Right.
And to consider what's true.
Yes.
So in effect, you're saying that these children, in the Bubbles case, aged 3 and 4, were too young to understand the truth.
No, not at all. What you are doing is distorting and twisting the language that a psychologist would use.
In relation to the Bubbles hearing, there were statements from the children saying, which I'm sure you read, what happened to them. There was positive ID of Tony Derrin as Mr. Bubbles by a number of children, plus the fact that at least 5 of the children, and all girls, were positively physically abused. Were you aware of the medical evidence at the time?
I have not reviewed the file that I had at that time.
But were you aware that there was evidence?
I'm going to stop this. We're done. I don't believe that you are being fair. And I don't believe that your approach is an impartial and objective one.
Why is that?
Because of the way that you're coming across. I mean, we're done, and I am not going to give you permission to use anything that you have taped up to this point.
You're getting a little defensive, aren't you, Mr. Underwager?
Oh, I'm getting pissed.
Do you think Underwager has got a lot to answer for over the years?
I think so. I think a lot of children have suffered at his hand. That children who probably have been abused have been put back into situations where they're likely to have been molested again.
I think that Underwager must have trouble sleeping.
Why don't you sit down and talk about
You are
all
to
your
leave.
facts,
You
all
are
this
to
research
leave.
that
You are
you
to
quote?
leave my home.
Mr. Underwager, you have
You are to
researched
leave my home.
and quoted
I am
research
not willing to
inaccurately
continue.
and distorted it for years.
I am not
and you
willing
know
to
it.
continue. You're a bastard.
No, I'm not.
You're a bastard.
I just love children.
And you're a bastard. To come here under false pretenses.
Not at all. Some say that you go to court under false pretenses, Mr. Underwager.
You leave my home. Your people can leave now. You go out the door now.
Questions getting a bit hard, were they?
You go out the door now.
I would like to ask you about your qualifications. In the Mr. Bubbles case, you said that your qualifications had never been questioned in relation to the Swan case.
You go out the door now.
You told an untruth in the Mr. Bubbles hearing.
You go out the door now.
You don't want to answer that?
I'm telling you to go out the door now, or I'm calling the police.
I think you've shown your true colours. We should leave. Thank you, Mr. Underwager. Appreciate your time. Definitely don't want to continue the interview?
Hey, I'm 61 years old Saturday. And I think you are one of the most dishonorable men that I have ever met.
That's what a lot of clinical psychologists say about you. You should be aware of that.
I am fully aware of that.
Ralph Underwager has testified for the defendants in about 400 child abuse cases. We wanted to question him about his performance in some of those and about other matters too. But, as you've seen, he didn't give us the chance. And by the way, you may remember that in our first Mr. Bubble story, two of the parents told us about a conversation they'd had with the New South Wales Attorney General, John Dowd. Mr. Dowd, of course, joined the Derrins in an attempt to stop that story going to air.
He just said, look, you're talking to me as if I think they're not guilty. My personal opinion is that they are guilty.
The Attorney General of New South Wales told you this?
Yes, he believes they are.
Well, Mr. Dowd has done it again. This time in a conversation with Jim Peters from the National Centre for the Prosecution of Child Abuse.
I commented that you were coming to see me in a couple of days about the Mr. Bubbles case. He then expressed the opinion that the defendants were, or the defendant was guilty, at least of some of the charges, but that it wasn't provable in court.
But there's no doubt in your mind the Attorney General told you he believed the defendant was guilty?
No, there's no doubt in my mind. He did tell me that.
Mr. Dowd still has the power to bring charges against Tony Derrin, but refuses to do so. And the New South Wales government continues to refuse all demands for a royal commission into the Mr. Bubbles case.